Taste, by the way, your podcast is so amazing.
Thank you. I so appreciate that. And I appreciate that you listen.
I'm a huge fan. And I usually am not a huge fan of podcasts.
Oh, well, I so appreciate that. I'm really excited because I'm doing a new season. Hopefully that's going to come out this weekend, depending on when I can get around to editing it. But it will be like going back to more long form types of conversations, which I'm very excited about.
That's cool. Would you like to tell a bit more about it? I mean, the topics and yeah.
Yes, a lot of it is going to be like it'll touch on DAOs, but it hopefully is a little bit more human centric, which is definitely closer to what it was before. Like I did the DAO mini series, which was really fun, but now it's going to be going back to the more human side of a lot of different topics, which I'm really excited about. So we talk about like capitalism. We'll be talking about um, sort of like self-awareness and how that changes how we create value systems in Web3, which I'm very excited about. So it should be fun.
Yeah, that sounds pretty cool actually. So more from the social human side. Yeah, I think that many people are interested to that because it becomes more of a place everybody has it in mind as a place that you can get more, and learning more about the human side of it is so cool.
Yes. And not everyone is into DAOs. So I want to make sure there's a good balance of DAO stuff and then more of those human anthropological sides.
Totally agree on that.
And today I wanted to talk about also governance as well. And I, because seeing from your tweets, it sounds like you've been thinking a lot about also the human side of governance and like what the behind the scenes. Was this what you meant with with the topic, or is it? Well, yeah, how's the scope? I was curious about that.
Yeah, I think a lot of the topics that I think the podcast will start to dive more into is less on like I think a lot of the stuff that I tweet about tends to be more tactical governance stuff, which is definitely on the human layer. I think right now, as of recording, which is like 3 episodes for the next season, it'll be a little bit more of exploring how humans experience Web3 more broadly. Like I kind of feel like governance will be part of it, but it's also about like I had Yancey from Meta Label on, which Yancey talks all about different value systems and being able to opt into them. I'm also having Stefan, who is in here, on, which is more about like what DAOs can learn from ecology. So it's definitely the human side still, but it's a little bit more high level, I think is probably a fair way to describe it. A little less tactical.
I see. I think we can start. So, guys, let me introduce you Chase a little bit. She's the co-founder of Decentology. She's been working with Rabbit Hole, Forefront, and many other organizations as well. So the introduction will go like way longer. So I wanted to make it as concrete as possible. Thank you so much, Chase, for coming. Today's talk will be about DAOs and DAO governance beyond governance tokens. So I'm very excited to listen. I want to give the floor to you.
To me?
Yes.
All right. Yeah, I can talk more broadly, or we can do more of a conversation, whichever one you prefer.
Yeah, like the idea of this event series is more like a casual discussion about a topic that we want to discuss with our friends. So whatever feels right and whatever feels comfortable to you. You can make a little, if you want, an introduction talk, and maybe we can go on with the discussion.
Okay, that sounds good. Yeah, I mean, I think around the topic of governance, one of the things that I think is really interesting that might be fun to explore is this question of the role of tokens in governance. I I know Prime DAO thinks a lot about tokens, so I think you guys would have a really interesting perspective on what that actually looks like. I think there are a lot of big questions around what it looks like to make sure that people who are participating in DAOs have a say in how organizations are run, even if they don't have access to a lot of capital or the ability to hold governance tokens. Because, of course, if you're a contributor being paid in the DAO's governance token, if you need to pay your rent, you're going to need to sell them potentially. So I think there are a lot of really interesting questions around the dynamics of how we think about governance tokens and how we think about governance more broadly when you have this like liquid power. So I'm curious how y'all think about that. I have my own thoughts, but I also feel like you all might have some deeper thinking on this.
Yeah, in Prime DAO, like we our governance works with reputation, like in a way that it represents the stakeholders of the DAO. It has its limitations because it's not so fluid as having a governance token, but at the same time, it kind of protects the decision making. So yeah, I tend to um, uh, find a lot of problems with governance tokens. Like, like as I think it's very much consensus right now in the space. Like, it's very easy to get plutocratic, and also, for example, with the delegations, we can see this kind of things that just happened with Bradley. It's kind of, yeah, that there are some problems. I feel that there are better ways to govern on chain that is not with this type transferable tradable governance tokens. And what you all think?
So I can go with it. So what I believe in a DAO, you want to attract three things: first, capital; second, labor; and third, expertise. So governance tokens are actually is part of this equation to how to attract those three qualities. So for example, one may argue that these kind of non-fungible reputation tokens will distort or will discourage capital to be invest in a DAO because the workers will choose maybe some decisions that is in favor of workers but not the capital per se. So I think while we are trying to build our governance mechanism, we have to try balance between those three capabilities. Like, I'm really against SOL, like transferable token weighted governance. So actually, what Prime DAO has done is interesting. So we have a reputation token, but this reputation token can be also earned by staking your Prime tokens, like D2D tokens. So it's both incentivizing capital to be to stake and like to invest in Prime DAO, and also it's incentivize workers and contributors to have a voice in the governance. So I think while we are thinking about any sort of governance, we should consider those parameters. That's not what I thought.
I agree. I think those are really interesting factors to be thinking through. I think one of the big questions that we have to deal with in the space is that so many of the organizations that are currently really prominent DAOs have raised capital and have done tokens in a way that creates an expectation around utility in order to bring in exactly what you're talking about, capital. And I do think that we have a really strange relationship with capital right now because it's what keeps a lot of Web3 afloat in terms of ensuring people can continue to build in the space and all of that. But it's also really unclear what the role of many of these governance tokens are going to be in the long term and whether or not that is aligned with what the people doing the labor in these communities agree with. And that's a tension that I'm seeing a lot more where you might have capital that's come in and now owns tokens. And drawing that line between the type of governance decisions that people doing the labor are making versus the types of governance decisions that people who've provided capital are making. And of course, there's overlap and all of that, but those do it feels like a challenging line to draw. So I don't know. I think there's a lot to navigate in that.
And what are some like solutions of governance methods you find so far the best ways to be governing DAOs at this point in a way that um, it both represents the capital and the workers.
I think the first part is definitely easier, but the second part of making sure that it represents both, I don't know that there are very many good examples of this. Examples that I personally like to use when it comes to thinking about really good governance systems. I like to look at sociocratic organizations. I think they've done a really interesting job governing. Um, I think it's still pretty unclear how we balance those things, but something that I've been thinking on is this notion that token holders should have the ability, or could is a much better word because I don't know that this is actually true, but this is what I've been thinking on a little bit, is this idea that token holders can delegate decision making power and execution power to specific groups. So, not like individual people per se, not like a total representative democracy, but instead groups of people who they really clearly have a specific scope that they can work within. And so basically, the role of the token is who's in charge, which is kind of in some ways like a public company and kind of not, which I think is a whole other conversation. But I think deciding on who they choose is to represent them essentially, or to make decisions is kind of an interesting framing. There are probably other uses of tokens, but I think that is the first to me that becomes really clear because you can still implement a sociocratic system beyond that because you have consent from token holders. I think making those things liquid is probably useful. Like, I think there are lots of experiments to be done, but that to me is one of the first ways that token holders can exist while also sort of not stepping on the toes of people who are doing the actual labor. I think cautionary tales, I look to like sushi, for example, and everything that happened with token holders needing to decide on things like compensation and all of the pain that was caused by that, which I think we definitely want to try to avoid. But I think we're going to have to do a lot of experiments to figure out what the right balance is and what the rights of token holders are versus the rights of people doing the labor.
A very interesting thing. I just wanted to ask, what do you think about like quadratic voting to be implemented to token weighted voting? So it may kind of balance the power disparity between token holders and give people who can hold less tokens to more power. So I think this is worth experimenting.
Yeah, I think this is a really interesting one. Index has kind of experimented with this, not quite in the way um, that you're talking about, but we've done different voting based on different voting weights based on how involved you are. We've also used like different weights based on coordinate, for example. So people who are really involved get more give and coordinate so they can allocate that to other people because they're expected to be higher context. I think it's really an interesting model. I think at the low levels, we start to see challenges where what I think you want to avoid is like someone who's been doing work for a year but doesn't have very many tokens. So if you're using their level of involvement as a multiple of their actual token ownership, then you kind of get into funky situations. But if you're doing it such that every contributor at a certain level gets a certain amount of votes and token holders get votes that are based on their token holdings, and you can sort of play around with those weights. I think it's really interesting. The one thing that concerns me a little bit is the notion of consensus or like majority votes, I guess would actually be the better way to think about it. I don't know that majority voting or governance based on a majority or needing to reach quorum is the best way to govern. Like when you look at a lot of organizations like sociocratic organizations, they use consent-based governance, which I think is a lot more interesting when it comes to being a resilient and flexible organization. So my worry then, and I think like this idea of weighted voting is a good one, but my worry does become now like this question of, okay, if we figure that out, then how do we think about what it really means for something to pass? And I think that's once we figure out the hurdle of how power is allocated, I think we're going to need to then get through the hurdle of what does it actually mean to have that power and what does a given proposal require to get over the finish line.
This, definitely resonate with this. It also makes me think, like all our systems are built like for majority somehow, and I feel there's a bit of colonial mindset of this because all the minorities they work towards they work toward the benefit of majority, and sometimes I question if it's the best way we can make decisions in our words somehow, and at the same time numerically, because also like like social minorities, for example, they're not numerically minorities, but the political power they have is much smaller than you see represented, and
Mm-hmm.
and at the same time it's just maybe there's a social construct that makes even the minorities to work towards this said majority, uh, to make to 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 fulfill the interests of this ruling structure, and and but then how can we change this with Web3?
I think this is like the really big problem because even when you look at like I think Web3 makes a lot of these things really explicit as opposed to implicit. So like in a traditional political system, this is happening no matter what. Because to your point, even if a minority is a majority, uh, in a power perspective, like when we think about the way that wealth is allocated across, let's say, like in the United States, that wealth does turn into power. And so I think we're now facing the same systems where a very small group of people actually hold a massive amount of voting power in a lot of these protocols as well. One of the ways that and I totally agree. Like I'm very concerned about this idea that that the majority are the votes that basically are heard, and you have this like inability for systems to take into account a wide variety of experiences and perspectives. So something that I think is really interesting is I was having a conversation with Danny Zuckerman from Ceramic, and he studied like political philosophy in college. And I was thinking a lot about like, what do these systems really look like, and how can we balance quote unquote expertise, where we like delegate to people who are quote unquote experts, which again, like that's based on how a majority like quantifies expertise and the type of expertise that they value. And a majority here again is like token holders, which doesn't even mean that it's actually representative of different people's interests. So anyway, there's expertise on one end, and then on the other end of the spectrum is I don't know that populism is the right word, but kind of. And basically his point was democratic systems work best when you're in the middle of delegating some type of expertise or really valuing a certain perspective and going to full on like populism. Because what you do is you decide, you give someone the authority to make decisions on your behalf, but those people have the power to take away that authority as well. And where I think things get interesting is creating spaces that very intentionally put people into positions of delegated power who belong to different minority groups, different minority perspectives, like all these different things that are not going to win over a majority vote, and then create consent based systems from there. And I think if we can do that, we'll be in a much better position. And the cool thing about the way that delegation works is like, even if you have, 2% of token supply and the majority, let's say, has like 98%, you could still delegate someone into a position where they have the right to object in a consent-based system. That gets into a lot of challenges around dynamics, though, of like multiple party systems and all of that stuff. But I think it's a really hard problem. I'm hopeful that consent-based systems and the ability to delegate so that people have the right to object will hopefully get at some of those challenges, but I don't know. I mean, I'm curious if either of you think that there's a better approach or something that is sort of more straightforward. I know that was a really long ramble.
I totally agree on the delegation. I'm sorry, Numa. A question. What do you think about having a cap on the vote that someone can have? So I get kind of more power as I participate in the governance. So I'm kind of interested in participate. And at the same time, for people who have the majority and a lot of power into the game, they have actually a limit that is not too high. So you're capable to reach the top if you participate and work within the DAO, but at the same time, a person that is on top, they have to delegate their power somewhere else.
I think it's a really interesting option. And I think that there's definitely something to that. Two things come to mind for me. One is the importance of delegating power based on and decision making authority and all of that based on really narrow scopes. So I think one of the biggest challenges with a lot of the systems of delegation that we have today, and even hierarchical systems more broadly, is that power is allocated generally across a pretty wide scope. So when you think about like a CEO, for example, a CEO makes decisions across product and marketing and every other like specific topic. And I think that's where a lot of these systems become much less effective, is just when you have power that is not only delegated to like a very small group of people, but that is like super broad. I think even in representative democracy in a place like the United States, that's one of the biggest challenges, is just that your representative makes decisions across a wide variety of topics that they are not educated as deeply in. And I think that that's a challenge. And it's not even just about that. It's like, then you create potential for abuses of power. So I think that is one thing that comes to mind when it comes to what limits really mean. Like, I don't think that limits are only votes delegated. I think it's also scope of power. And then I think the other thing that's been on my mind a lot is this question of making these systems very explicit representations of what's actually already happening. Anytime that we introduce like arbitrary limits, whether that be duration of, how long something can last from like a holding a position perspective to the, number of votes that you can be delegated, I think it's always important to experiment and play around with what that number actually should and could look like and make it very flexible. Because otherwise you end up with this like arbitrary number. But I think having a limit's really interesting.
Yeah, that is true. Based on that, on what you were talking about, let's say that we have delegators in the system. What do you think if they should have a persona, and what could be that persona? If, let's say, we have 10 delegators, they should be diversified, so they have to have different skill set, I guess, and different mindsets. So we have the overall idea. What do you think that could be the personas that they would represent each category of people?
I think that it depends a lot on the protocol that's being governed. Like, there's very technical decisions. There are decisions around people and operations. Like, there are a lot of those types of decisions. I'm very excited about this idea that delegates should be able to delegate to other people. And a good example of this is actually in like Rabbit Hole's meta governance, for example. Rabbit Hole as an organization is onboarding people into Web3, trying to help teach them and all of that kind of stuff. I think that Rabbit Hole should be a specialist in education and onboarding into Web3. But I actually don't think that the Rabbit Hole like community that is, for example, being delegated votes in ENS should necessarily be making decisions on the people and operations side. Not because they don't have an opinion, but because I just think that there are other organizations who think all of the time about people and operations or inclusivity in these communities and all of that. And so I'm actually really interested in delegates representing a very specific viewpoint, like you're talking about, and then being able to delegate decision specific, like if something has to do with people and operations, Rabbit Hole should be able to delegate that type of decision to SHE-256, or say we are going to follow in SHE-256's lead when it comes to these types of decisions. So I think it's really important to have a diversity of perspectives, but I also think it's important to just have like a focus and then be able to delegate decision making on different governance proposals to people who have that specific focus. Now, I don't know that even from a technical level that needs to happen. Like, I think today Rabbit Hole could say we will always follow SHE-256's voting patterns on this topic. And if you delegate to us, you've effectively also delegated to them for this reason. So I think there are a lot of like interesting ways to think about these things in today's system. Longer term, of course, you would be able to choose those people potentially. Like, there are different ways to think about this, but yeah, I think a diversity of perspectives and a very specific focus, depending on what the protocol is doing, might be really powerful.
This speaking of limits to power, like it makes me remember, wouldn't that be the case as well for separation of powers in a DAO? Like, separation of powers. What do you think?
Yeah, I think that's very much what you start to get. And I think you can also create systems that have these like checks and balances on each other. And I think that's a really powerful way to begin to build more complex and sustainable organizations. I personally think that the problem in some of these organizations becomes when you don't make that explicit, and then you end up with a system where, like, technically one working group has this weird power over the other. I'm much more interested in making a lot of those things very explicit. But I think having a separation of power is powerful. And I also think that building those systems of checks and balances, even on token holders, like if you do have a very basic system where token holders vote on a lot of different things, I think it's actually quite healthy to have checks and balances. And I think that, like, making those explicit makes it a lot less, I guess, problematic later when, the protocol is like, oh, actually, we're going to ignore the vote the token holders had.
Yeah,
Mark, do you want to? I feel.
yeah, like these are very interesting discussions, but I would like to ask something kind of relevant. So if you want to look at something relevant, go ahead. I will ask later.
Oh, can you say that again with your friends?
Yeah, so I want to ask something relevant. So if you want to ask something relevant to this topic, this point, please go ahead. I will ask later.
Why would my any other question be more relevant than yours? Because it's changing the topic, or
Yeah, it's kind of not
okay.
like I wanted to ask actually about consensus mechanism. So I would like to ask Chase what she thinks about voting systems such as like conviction voting. It is sort of trying to measure consensus because as a minority, if you are holding your tokens in a proposal more than others, it will give you more power. So it includes assertion in the equation as a parameter or as a part of the equation. I think this can be beneficial in the future, like how we are thinking about voting systems, maybe continuous signaling be part of the system where we can have consensus. We can actually like getting closer to consensus. Let's.
Do you mean like, are you talking about signaling in the sense of people who have the most tokens?
No, so the common stacks conviction voting. So when you put tokens in a proposal longer time, it will grow in a time, so it will have more weight. Let's say if you put it 3 days before in the proposal and wait for 3 days, you will have more saying than when you put it before 1 day and wait for a day. So while you are waiting, you will signal that you want this proposal to pass more than other proposals.
Yes. I'm really curious to see different implementations of this. The thing that I'm learning in my own work with DAOs is that being really flexible is a key part of making really great governance agreements. And so I think that conviction voting is a really interesting way to curate um, different discussions around governance. I'm a little bit less convinced of actually curating, like, and deciding on, specific outcomes or details. Like, I think one of the things that that's been really interesting to watch in the case of Index is we've done a lot of experimentation around having like this council, and that's been really good. But there are a lot of changes that some people think should be made, and other people don't think that those changes should be made, and they think that it should be sort of like we'll just keep it as it is. And so I think the big question here becomes, what types of perspectives are you trying to take into account? How much is time like a factor versus other types of things? How many decisions do you need to be making? Because I think having a flexibility around those things is really good as well.
I think that's a strong answer. That's a strong argument. Like, I kind of buy your argument actually. So yeah, interesting discussions. Let's say.
Yeah, the idea of conviction though is really interesting, but just maybe there's other ways than time to measure conviction. And also makes me
Mm,
question. Also makes me question. Like I want to maybe go back a bit to something I wanted to ask, because you've been talking a lot about consent, and I think this is a like very crucial word for us to like get better as a society in general,
hmm
because we are not. I don't know. Our society is not consent based. There's when you were born, people assign a lot of things into you. There's it starts from even before you're born, like things you
hmm
never consented to. And and a question like in any type of organization, would it be a DAO or a cooperative? I would say like how could we visualize content? Like how like what signals is that consent? And how yeah I, because it feels tricky to me, but maybe because we're not so much well, the way we were like raised in the society in general, it's we're not so yeah, there's something things we have to explore. So my question to you is like how do you visualize Chase, how do you visualize consent in an organization?
Yeah. I mean, I think you're totally right. And I think it's useful to first define what consent means. And to me, it's the ability to say no to something. And so, like in sociocracy, it's the ability to object. But when you think about consent in all like forms, the way that like I think a lot of it manifests is the world is working in some way, and you as someone who is affected by that have the right to say, no, I object to that movement. Um, I think the question becomes upon what like criteria do you object? Because you could ask for consent um, to, you know, go and do a proposal in an organization or for someone to like take you on a date, let's say. Um, and the questions that you're asking there are very different. Like maybe for going on a date, you're asking yourself, do I want to do this? And like that's your criteria because you can spend that time however you want. As an individual, you hopefully are like intimate with your wants and needs, and you have the ability to choose yes or no. When you think about it in an organization, there are often a lot more people and a lot more opinions about what should and shouldn't happen to take into account. And so it becomes challenging because when we ask for consent from everyone in an organization, it becomes this question of, okay, well, what one person wants is, you know, X, and what another person wants is Y, and what another person wants is Z. And trying to settle on finding a middle ground is often really challenging. And so as you get larger, you kind of need to decide like, okay, well, who are we asking consent from? Which is a really important question. For example, if you have a working group or you know, a group that is in charge of like social media, they're probably the ones that you want to be asking consent from for social media specific decisions. In the same way that like if you want to go to a certain restaurant and your group of friends you're supposed to be going to dinner with your group of friends, you probably should get consent from them because the decision impacts them and it's specifically related to how they spend their time. So okay, we've narrowed it down to who you're actually getting consent from. Now the question becomes, are you asking them what they want to do, like, or what they should think we should do? Like, what is the level of criteria that we're actually asking consent from? And what sociocracy suggests that I'm a really big fan of is two questions. One is this good enough for now? And is this safe to try? And when you ask both of those questions, you don't, instead of saying, hey, should we do this? And is this the best idea ever? And do you consent to this under the pretenses that it's like the best thing we can do, which is really hard because you're going to get so many different opinions, even in a small group of people. Instead, you say, is this safe to try and good enough for now? And from that perspective, objections are actually someone saying that feels like it has irreversible or very significant negative impacts on what we're doing and our aims. And so if you suggest a restaurant that is like going to give people food poisoning, then people will object and say, no. But if it's like, not their ideal Friday night, but they're okay with trying it and it feels safe to try, then they might say, yeah. And so I think that's a really important framing for consent because it allows you to keep moving, but it doesn't totally ignore the needs of different people. And one of the things that I really love about consent-based governance that that self-managing orgs and sociocracy often use is this notion that the party or parties who object are responsible for working with the proposer to instead propose something that would make it good enough for now and safe to try. And when you do that, instead of having this whole ordeal about like, oh, well, is this going to work? And well, now we don't have like consent. How are we going to deal with this? It instead becomes just like, oh, okay, cool. Here's the proposal to make this better, and we're now going to try that. Consent and how I think sociocracy has presented consent. And I think it's a really interesting way to frame it.
On this concept, I really love the responsibility that you take in order to find a new solution. It's something I feel that is needed in this space.
Yeah, and I think it kind of helps foster a culture that listens a little bit more. Like I think right now when people, say no to a proposal or disagree with a statement, we often tend to make it about the person or about a project. And I think by putting the responsibility on the person who objects to work with a proposer to make it safe to try and good enough for now, you create a space where like listening to the person who objects and why they object and what their perspective is makes it just a much I think more open and sort of like leaning towards listening type of culture, which I think is really beneficial.
Exactly. It takes away the complaining part and makes you more open to listen. It's pretty amazing.
Exactly.
Hello, guys. Sorry, I joined it late, so I don't know if we are allowed to make questions and to participate.
Yes.
May I make a question? Am I allowed?
Yeah, definitely. Please feel free to do so.
So, oh, great then. I would like to ask if you think that being driven by votes and the majorities, this will drive us to mediocrity, because Gamma just made an association with society and organizations like those, and to say in the political field here in Brazil, we have mechanisms to give voice to the minorities, so they can express themselves like the majority does, with the same power, let's say. And also I have the feeling like maybe the majority can be, it can kill some geniality, something genuine, some spontaneous. Do you think that being driven only the majority, only by votes, can guide us to mediocrity? This is the real question.
Yeah. I mean, I think that that's like the ultimate case for not having the majority vote on every decision. I think the other thing to probably consider is this question of how you have delegates being selected. I think probably matters a lot, because you're going to have different people who are going to delegate to different representatives based on that representative's focus and the delegates, the person who's delegating, their interests. I think the question becomes, can you actually have minority interests represented? And what is if you think about consent-based governance, what is the minimum threshold to have the option to say no? Because if you have everyone who has a single vote delegated to them with the right to object, you could never have decisions made. Like, you basically have the equivalent of a human DDoS attack, where you just have everyone saying, I have an objection, and then you never pass anything. So you need a threshold. I think there's a really interesting case to be made for this idea that collective intelligence doesn't come from homogenous perspectives, and that perhaps actually having a diversity of perspectives and philosophies represented will actually improve collective intelligence and decision making at the DAO-wide level. So I'm very curious to see if we're able to come up with mechanisms that and arguments for actually putting people into decision making positions, even if they don't hold as many delegated votes, but still giving them the right to object. And I'm not exactly sure what that's going to look like, but I think that there are a few things to play around with on that level if you use consent-based governance with democratic sort of representation style to experiment with on that.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, Ms. That was a very good call for questions. Thanks a lot. And every it's always open for everyone to speak. Sorry if we hijacked a bit the talk. So, but yeah, feel free to speak your mind. We are all together. Or ask questions.
I wanted to go back some minutes because I think I didn't hear the argument of Chase on conviction voting, and I'm kind of interested to know what was the point.
Can you repeat the first part of what you said?
Yeah, like I didn't hear your point on conviction voting. Like, why are not you convinced on using conviction voting?
Oh, I'm not convinced on conviction, the actual decision on whether or not to pass something as an agreement or a proposal, because I think that mental flexibility and willingness to incorporate different perspectives is really important. And I think like conviction voting can certainly be useful based on the situation. Like, I think if time is of the element, if you have a lot of proposals to curate and decide what to vote on, spend time on, if for some reason like the amount of time someone has like maybe been thinking about something or convinced of something somehow makes that more like has a real scalable impact on the accuracy of the not accuracy but like
efficacy of the proposal, then I think it's interesting. But in practice, like, I don't know, I guess most of the decisions that I've made at a DAO level or through these processes, what we thought early on was often not incorporating a lot of people's perspectives. And often, like, having that flexibility to shape and change our ideas when we took into account the perspectives of different people and the reasons that different people didn't think something was good enough or safe to try. Like, that's a really valuable discussion to be had. And so, yeah, I guess this notion of like of someone thinking that a given proposal was the most important thing, and then holding that belief, it doesn't to me seem in a lot of cases like the most important factor in a proposal or in the DAO more broadly. Which doesn't mean it can't be useful in other situations. I don't know that it is like the perfect way to think about like whether or not to pass a proposal, for example.
Anyone wanted to ask something to Chase?
I would actually ask a question, but for someone else, because Pab, you're from One Hype, right? You posted about Celeste, and this sounds really interesting. Can you share, tell us a bit about it. It seems it's a Celeste is a governance method or decision maker method by One Hype. So
Hi everyone, I'm Pablo. Right now, I'm not a super active contributor at OneHive. I'm just chilling, to be honest. But I really like Celeste, and I think what Chase was speaking about in regards to like dispute resolution and solving problems and having people have discussions and coming to like decisions as a community, etc. I just felt Celeste was like really relevant to what we were mentioning a couple minutes ago. How OneHive uses it is, well, continuing on the whole like conviction voting thing. Well, OneHive obviously uses conviction voting, but the way it works is people can have enough conviction to make a proposal pass, but the broader community at any point with Celeste has the opportunity or like the option to challenge any proposal that they think may not go, say, hand in hand with the values that every member agrees to uphold by signing the covenant in the garden. Gardens, by the way, is like the platform, I'd say, or like the framework. It's not it's like a product OneHive has been working on for more than a year now. It launched not that many months ago, maybe 2-3 months ago. I may be wrong though. Don't
Yeah, it
quote me
was
on any of
in
this.
December.
Yeah, so to be how Celeste works is people stake honey, and depending on the amount of honey you stake, the chances of you getting drafted to say get involved in like a topic or a discussion well are higher, say, but it's always random. So yes, someone who stakes more honey has more chances, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they will get drafted all the time over anyone who has a lot less honey staked in the protocol. I don't know, I just thought it's like a really interesting tool, and I don't know, I don't think that many people know about it, which is why I care to share. I don't know if anyone has any questions about it. I'm not an expert, but I'd be down to discuss or like just talk about it in general if anyone has anything they want to ask about it.
Yeah, I'll say, like, I think I personally conviction voting in some of those before, because I think some of the things that you're talking about with different implementations of it could definitely be interesting. And the idea of like staking, is it they use stake honey? Is that the right
Yeah,
terminology?
so one hive is like this DAO, which the intention is for it to become like this big DAO where there's like lots of like little DAOs which all converge in like with like this token called honey. I'm not super sure, to be honest, how much of it is open source. I believe all of it is open source. Again, don't quote me on that. NT may be able to.
Yeah, the I'm sure pretty much everything on Hive is open source. And like Celeste is pretty much a fork of Aragon Core, which some of you may be more familiar with. And as far as I know, it functions similarly to Kleros, the court system. But like essentially, DAOs make a constitution, and you can challenge any proposal that goes against that constitution. And so the community decides how flexible are the terms within the constitution. So that's sort of the criteria to challenge any proposal. And then like
Also,
you are
these
incentivized.
DAOs. Oh,
Oh yeah,
sorry.
go
Go
ahead.
ahead. I didn't mean to. Go.
Uh,
You.
oh well, I was just going to say that essentially you stake honey as signaling that you're up to secure Celeste overall. And so in the case of Gardens, because Celeste right now the only application for Celeste is Gardens, but they are planning to make like a bounty app that uses Celeste to mediate conflicts and so much stuff. But in the case of Gardens, when a proposal is challenged, people is like incentivized to vote within the majority, assuming that the majority of people are going to vote according to the covenant. And so a portion of your stake, if you vote or like if you vote against, a portion of your stake is given to the ones who voted um, in favor of the majority. And so like that's kind of the mechanism to secure all the whole DAO.
Yeah, I definitely need to check out more of the parameters around how conviction voting can be implemented, basically. So that's interesting. I
I
need to
wanted
dive
to add
in.
something. So the way Gardens works is the way you make a proposal is you need to basically put in like some honey as collateral. And so if your proposal gets challenged, that collateral in the end, if the proposal does pass, it goes back to whoever made the proposal. But if the proposal, once it's challenged, the community decides that it should not go through, the collateral is distributed between the people who participated in the whole challenging process, uh, which I think is a nice way of like incentivizing people to care about their like anti-set constitution. The word Gardens uses is covenant, but yeah, it's basically the same thing. So
Yeah, I definitely have to check that out. I have to run in a minute, but you guys have given me some homework for this weekend, which is wonderful because looking at specific implementations of conviction-based voting, I think will be a lot more interesting. So I'll have to check out the
in my
garden and all
opinion,
that stuff.
I don't know. I feel like it's really a step forward to decentralization. The fact that anyone can make a proposal and conviction on it can make it pass, just as long as it fits these boundaries set by the covenant. But yeah, I don't want to make this whole thing about One Hive and Celestine Gardens. So,
Well,
if
it's
anyone wants to move
interesting.
on,
It's helpful. It's helpful to me because it's a
I
real.
find it super interesting.
Yeah, it's helpful because it's a real use of it. So I have an implementation to now dive into.
I just
Yeah,
want to say that I think, in my opinion, it's pretty good for like meta decisions on a large scale or meta organization. Because I feel like with conviction, you don't really need to know. Like you can have groups like sub DAOs or whatever subgroups in organization in both extremes of the organization, and one like one extreme doesn't have to know what the other extreme thinks because they can just
and
like
also
their meeting.
you stop relying on, say a bad actor makes a proposal and he's a whale and has a bunch of whale friends. You stop having to rely on having to like rally the community to vote no for the proposal, and instead you have this whole like protocol that lets you challenge it and like go through a dispute resolution process without needing to rally a big percentage of the community, which when communities get big, that can be really hard to vote no, like I said. I don't know. If anyone wants to continue or add anything or ask anything, I don't know.
I need to run because I have another call, but this was really fun and I appreciate the perspectives. I've definitely got some research to look into, so I'm excited.
Thank you so much
Thanks,
for
everyone.
coming.
Thank you so much,
Thanks.
Chase, for being here. So cool.
Thank
It's been
you.
a pleasure.
I also gonna
Thank
have to hop off.
See you guys. It was nice chatting.
Bye. Take care.
Thank
I
you,
Thanks, bye.
everybody.